So, although there are many significant peace processes around the world, I have considered it interesting to analyze the conflict in Chiapas and, of course, the mediation processes that followed. As I believe that although there are a lot of who argue that this Chiapas peace process wasn't fully implemented and it is still a challenge for Mexico's democratic transition, I believe that the processes and the procedures that were achieved were key in transforming from a system based on a semi authoritarian corporative rule to a competitive liberal democracy. So, in order to understand Chiapas conflict and why there was the famous armed uprising in San Cristobal de las Casas in January 1994, we have to talk about the long fought struggle by the indigenous people of Chiapas against poverty, violence, and discrimination. These indigenous peoples made up 35% of Chiapas population, and also when we talk about poverty, over 70% of the inhabitants earn less than minimum wage. 40% of those had never been to school. Of course, when we talk about children, and also another expression of economic exclusion was the state's lanyard tenure system, in which the communities of Chiapas lived under a semi-feudal pattern of landholding, where most of the communities were reduced to subsistence agriculture and seasonal migration to large plantations, while those small producers with enough land to generate profits generally had uncertain land titles and were forced to fight constant battles with large landowners. Um, so, as dramatic as these poverty and discrimination indicators are, the communities had suffered this situation for nearly 5 centuries before the rebellion. And eventually, this lack of institutional space for expressing themselves, and also the conclusion of the NAFTA in January 1994, led to a sense of exclusion. And it's when the Chiapas declared war on the Mexican government. So I've divided the peace processes into three kind of periods. The first one is the talks in the cathedral. Then there's the San Andres peace processes, and finally it's when Vicente Fox enters in the administration and partially implements the agreements of the San Acuerdos de San Andres. So that will be the division. So between February and March 1994, talks in the cathedral took place. There was the participants were Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the indigenous communities, and of course the role of the church was really important. Bishop Ruiz was the only mediator, and he was key in pushing for new forms of social organization and for letting his church to be where the negotiations took place. Also, he started a new political initiative in October 1994 to strengthen the mediation process, but also he created the Comisión Nacional de Intermediación, CONAI, to serve as an intermediary organization for a second round of peace negotiations once the new national government took over. Bishop Ruiz and CONAI constituted impartial mediation, and thanks to this role of impartiality, they led a flexible movement for both parties to started to understand each other and arrive to an agreement. However, negotiations broke down in February 1995 when the government attempted a short police and military campaign to capture Subcomandante Marcos, and then this generated it was a substantial backlash in Mexican public opinion. Also, it's important that in March 1995, there was the Dialogue, Conciliation, and Just Peace in Chiapas Act. It was signed, and it set the blueprint also for a new peace process, which, and also created the Congresional Comisión de Concordia y Pacificación, which would participate in the process, which would be, of course, the San Andres peace process. It was in February 1996 that the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional and the federal and state governments, together with COCOPA and CONAI, signed the Acuerdos de San Andres. They set a framework for constitutional changes that would recognize the differential collective rights for indigenous groups within clearly specified territorial boundaries in accordance with the International Labour Organization Treaty 169 on indigenous rights. CONAI helped a lot, to include in the agenda economic, political, and social issues. And in fact, the four main parts of the agenda of the Ejército Zapatista were indigenous rights, development, women's rights, and political reforms. Um, so although they had different views, they kind of reached an agreement which largely endorsed the Ejército Zapatista's position, but left, of course, a space for interpretation and misinterpretation in which in issues that they couldn't agree. The Kunai was a really important. Well, the Cocopa and the Kunai, yes, they were really important in the in like as a mediation actors. And finally, after the signing of the Acuerdo de San Andres, the peace process collapsed, and there was a disagreement over the role of media in the international community. And this led to the paramilitary attacks that culminated in the massacre on December 22, 1997, which claimed 45 lives. There were also a series of other attacks in the northern part of Chiapas. And well, these caused a really tremendous impact in the Chiapas government and the territory. And now we will see what happens next. So after the massacre and the collapse of the Acuerdo de San Andres, there was a culture of silence in the indigenous peoples of Chiapas. And the third period, which I wanted to explain, was in 2000, when Vicente Fox was elected and put an end to the dominance of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, and in fact, Fox government accepted the San Andres Agreement, with the exception of the autonomy provision, and pushed for its implementation in the constitution. That's why I've said that it's a partial implementation. And well, in fact, the Zapatistas and their allies saw it as a betrayal of both the spirit and letter of the Acuerdo de San Andres, because it wasn't exactly this the same agreement that they had reached in the Acuerdo de San Andres. But of course, others saw it as a positive step, and they were happy with this administration. So, although Chiapas' ceasefire and kind of peace agreement has certainly proved better than a protracted war, but definitive resolution of the conflict seems unlikely, and there's a kind of an armed peace nowadays. But the challenge is for the government to realize that the crisis continues to undermine the full transition to democracy. The Chiapas conflict thus poses a broader question for Mexico's democracy, having to do with the nature of inclusion and citizenship, as the Zapatistas and their allies are looking for a democracy based on recognizing both individual and collective citizenship rights. And they are kind of skeptical of this liberal democracy that they are nowadays living in. Another challenge is, of course, to solve the root causes of the conflict. So they need to approach to a peace process in which they address the root causes. These roots are of course, concerning the self-determination of the people, regulation of the land, the reform of the judicial system, and the police, and of course, these will need to all this process will have to be in accordance with building a confidence of the communities, and thus, in order to finally reach an agreement within the Zapatistas group. Also, of course, another challenge is to construct an effective and inclusive federal presence in Chiapas, as the federal government is really weak and its role is really weak. And this will require to reactivate or update the Coordinación para el Diálogo y la Negociación en Chiapas, which appears to operate in isolation without the ability to establish agreements or coordinate resources from the rest of the federal government. So the case of Chiapas provides an important lesson on the value of inclusivity. Its success should not be measured only in terms of whether the parties managed to achieve an agreement, but also in terms of whether and to what extent the process managed to transform society. And indeed, in the Chiapas case, it has entirely changed society's view, not only at local level, but also at the national level. And the society has been transformed thanks to the growing participation of the population in the processes, the peace processes, and also due to the Ejército Zapatista's role, how it has grown and it has gone from a position in which was marginalized to now a position which has grown political and economically. Also, another lesson, is the transformation of the state level. How there has been the local governments of Oaxaca, for instance, have adopted their constitution, and the federal government has made significant changes that wouldn't have been able if it hasn't been for these peace processes. And it has also impacted a lot the process on civil society and political groups across Mexico. And finally, we have to, the Chiapas case is an interesting lesson also in terms of a model in which there has been a combination of mediation techniques with different modalities of peace processes, and they have included a lot of different stakeholders at different phases. So Chiapas case shows that there is not one best model for inclusion. It is throughout the combination of different formats that Chiapas has managed to broaden the inclusion of actors and representation of issues in its process. So, finally, to conclude this extensive analysis of Chiapas peace process, it can be noted that Chiapas peace process is an example and has set an example for future peace processes as one of that has been multidimensional and strategical mediation process. But of course, there is still an ongoing struggle for more indigenous rights in the region, which undermines the total transition of Mexico into democracy. So it is we have to put it in question marks towards if there will be a full democracy in Mexico. And of course, finally, also I've searched for the recent advancements. We have seen that in 2003, the Zapatistas announced the reorganization of their territorial structure. They would reorganize in regional units, the Zapatista communities, which they were called caracoles. And now in 2019, Subcomandante Moises of the Ejército Zapatista also created 7 more new caracoles, together with 4 new autonomous municipalities. So they are experiencing an exponential growth, and it seems that the Ejército Zapatista is starting to also gain a steam in the political sphere of Mexico.